we could be on the cusp of a junk food Armageddon. Recently, we've seen the stocks of some of the largest food and beverage companies in the world plunge due to concerns about how GLP-1 drugs could impact their businesses. I posted a video about GLP-1 drugs and the massive impact they could have on the economy and corporations about a month ago. But since then, we've gotten some new data that sheds more light on the potential economic effects of these drugs. I'm going to talk about that in a second, but first, here's a quick recap of GLP-1 drugs for those of you who aren't familiar with them. So GLP-1 drugs are a new class of medicines that were originally designed to treat diabetes. They mimic GLP-1, which is a hormone that regulates blood sugar. Now, GLP-1 drugs have been used to treat diabetes for almost 2 decades, but as these drugs have gotten more powerful and longer lasting, people started to notice something miraculous. In addition to lowering blood sugar levels, GLP-1 drugs cause people to lose weight. And not just a little bit of weight, a lot of weight. Taking GLP-1 drugs like Ozempic, Wegovy, and Mounjaro can lead to weight loss of 15%, 20%, or even more. For the millions of people who struggle with obesity, this is a complete game changer. The potential to lose so much weight by taking a single medication is huge. So naturally, as more and more people have learned about the weight-losing effects of these drugs, demand has exploded. It's gotten to the point where the pharmaceutical companies which make these drugs, Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly, are having trouble keeping up with demand. Wall Street analysts expect that the number of patients on these drugs could soar into the millions, while sales of the drugs could climb to $100 billion or more by the end of the decade. But the economic impact of these drugs isn't limited to just the sales of the drugs themselves. If things play out the way most people expect, there's going to be repercussions all across the economy. One area in particular that's been getting a lot of scrutiny is the food industry. You see, GLP-1 drugs cause people to lose weight by making them feel fuller and less hungry. So as the demand for GLP-1 drugs really started to take off over the past year, some people began speculating that we would eventually see a noticeable drop in food consumption. It turns out they were right. We're now starting to get some real data on the impact that GLP-1 drugs have on the demand for food, and it's pretty astonishing. Morgan Stanley recently surveyed 300 people who are taking these drugs, and according to their survey, people on these medicines reduce their calorie intake by a whopping 20 to 30%. Now today, with only a couple million people using GLP-1 drugs, that's not all that consequential for an industry as large as the food industry. But over the next several years, as more and more people start to use these drugs, the impact could become much bigger. By 2035, Morgan Stanley estimates that 24 million Americans, or 7% of the population, could be using anti-obesity drugs. If that 7% of the population reduces their calorie intake by 20 to 30%, then we could see a significant decrease in calorie consumption for the nation as a whole. It's hard to say exactly how much the decrease would be. If that 7% of Americans ate the average amount of calories, then the decrease would be around 1.5 to 2%. But more likely, that 7% eats a much larger than average amount of calories. So if they cut back, it's probably going to translate into a much bigger decrease at the national level, maybe 3 or 4%. Now, that might not seem like a lot, but it's significant when you consider that in recent years, the total amount of calories consumed in the US has grown really slowly because of healthier eating habits and sluggish population growth. So in that context, a 2, 3, or 4 percentage point decline in food consumption is a big shift. But it's not just about the overall change in calorie consumption. Some parts of the food industry are going to get hit much harder than others. That's because the decline in calorie intake among GLP-1 users isn't evenly distributed. Morgan Stanley's survey showed that users of the drugs cut back on their consumption of unhealthy foods dramatically while increasing their consumption of healthier foods. For instance, over 2/3 of survey respondents reported eating fewer salty snacks, baked products, and confections. Over 3/4 of them visited fast food restaurants less frequently, and over 1/5 of respondents gave up drinking alcohol and sugary beverages completely. On the other hand, consumption of fruits and vegetables, poultry and fish, as well as dairy products stayed the same or even increased. Separate research from JP Morgan and Barclays, which looked at actual purchases made by GLP-1 drug users, showed similar results. People on these drugs buy a lot less food, and especially junk food. So this is some pretty eye-opening data, and it could spell bad news for the companies that sell those foods. Hershey, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, etc. Which is especially concerning for these companies companies is that a lot of the demand for their products comes from a relatively small number of customers, many of whom could be future users of GLP-1 drugs. For instance, just 20% of customers at fast food restaurants like Chick-fil-A, Jack in the Box, and Carl's Jr. account for well over half of spending at those chains. There's a similar pattern for other food and beverage categories. The top 20% of customers account for 70% of ice cream consumption, 75% of coffee consumption, 77% of soda consumption, and 90% of alcohol consumption. So based on these numbers, you can see how this could be a big problem for the companies that sell these products. If tens of millions of people start to use GLP-1 drugs to lose weight, and many of those GLP-1 users are top customers of junk food and beverage products, then it's possible that there could be some pretty nasty declines in the sales of those products. You could even call it an Armageddon scenario. Now, this is just one way in which things could play out. And the stocks of some of the largest food companies in the world, Nestle, Pepsi, General Mills, McDonald's, and many more, plummeted in recent weeks based on the fear that this is the way that things are going to evolve. That said, none of this is a foregone conclusion. There's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen, and things might not play out the way I laid out in this video. The biggest area of uncertainty surrounds what the uptake of GLP-1 drugs is going to be. While Morgan Stanley is forecasting that 24 million Americans could be using anti-obesity drugs by 2035, Barclays has a less aggressive estimate of 8 million by 2033. The cost of these drugs, which in some cases is over $1,000 per month, could slow their growth. Side effects like nausea and the increased risk of thyroid cancer could also discourage some people from using them. Then there's also the possibility that people who are on GLP-1 drugs could stop using them after they reach their target weight. So it could be the case that GLP-1 drugs won't be as widely used as many are predicting. Personally, I don't think that's likely based on what we know today. I mean, the potential market for anti-obesity drugs is just so big. Over 100 million people in the US and close to 1 billion people worldwide are obese. A lot of those people are probably going to give these drugs a shot. Okay, but even if that's the case and GLP-1 drugs take off, we don't know for sure how the usage of these drugs will affect food consumption. I've talked about some of the early data we have on food consumption trends of GLP-1 users, but that data is based on surveying or measuring the purchases of a really small sample of people over a short period of time. We don't know whether those trends would apply to a larger population of GLP-1 users over the long term. Maybe the big declines in junk food consumption by GLP-1 users that we're seeing so far are a reflection of people being really careful about their diets when they first start using these drugs. But as time goes on, maybe they loosen up a bit and start to eat more junk food. Some people even think that GLP-1 drugs are going to increase the demand for unhealthy foods. One Barclays analyst argues that people are going to cycle on and off GLP-1 drugs. And when they're off the drugs, they're going to eat a lot more junk food than they normally would because they know they can lose any weight they gain by using the drugs again. It's an interesting theory. I don't know if I buy into it, but it just goes to show that the debate about how GLP-1 drugs are going to impact food demand is far from settled. For me, the bottom line is this. Based on what we know today, I think it's safe to say that GLP-1 drug adoption is going to grow substantially in the coming years. And that in turn is going to lead to fewer calories being consumed in the US, as well as other developed countries that have a high prevalence of obesity. Demand for some foods, like healthy foods, fruits, vegetables, yogurt, and the like, will probably go up, while demand for other foods, especially junk foods, will go down. Does that mean that all companies that sell unhealthy foods are toast? Not necessarily. A lot of companies are already talking about premiumization, or getting customers to spend more money on higher quality products. If companies can successfully sell premium products for more money, then they might be able to maintain or even increase their profits despite consumers eating fewer calories. But not all companies will be able to do this. It's probably easier for a company like Hershey to sell more expensive premium chocolates than it is for a company like Jack in the Box to sell more expensive premium burgers. So there's going to be a wide spectrum of winners and losers in the food industry from the growth of GLP-1 drugs. Some companies are going to be very negatively impacted, some might see little impact, while others could even benefit. From an investment perspective, I'm going to be keeping a close eye on the stocks of the major food companies. There could be buying opportunities in some names that get whacked too hard due to fears about GLP-1 drugs. On the other hand, stocks of companies that can't adapt to the new reality could go down further from here. We'll see what happens. If you want more insights on investing, business, and the economy, be sure to hit that subscribe button.